We've explored the origins of consciousness before on The Evolving Leader with Mark Solms. In this show, we talk to Anil Seth, who, like Mark, is attempting to break down one of the greatest mysteries facing us. How do we have this sense of ourselves? By combining the analytical approach of neuroscience with the study of our subjective experience. He shares insights gathered in his new book, Being You, in a deeply enjoyable conversation.
Hey folks, welcome to The Evolving Leader. I'm Scott Allender.
And I'm John Gomes.
How are you feeling today, my friend?
I'm very excited. Very excited. That's all I'm going to say.
That's all you're going to say. I can see it on your face. So I believe you're feeling. I'm feeling excited too. I'm all smiles as well because today we are joined by Anil Seth. Anil is professor of cognitive and computational neuroscience at the University of Sussex. In his work, he seeks to understand the biological basis of consciousness by bringing together research across neuroscience, mathematics, AI, computer science, psychology, philosophy, and psychiatry. His new book, Being You, has been a huge success, particularly as it provides a really accessible route into some of the most complex frontiers of neuroscience and takes on possibly one of the most controversial aspects of the discipline. What is consciousness? Professor Seth, welcome to The Evolving Leader.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Welcome. How are you feeling today?
I have to tell you, I'm feeling rather exhausted at the moment. It's one thing writing a book, which is hard enough. I didn't really anticipate how busy I would be in the aftermath of its publication. But it's great. I do get the sense that people are reading it and getting something from it. But it's a bit of an exhausting roller coaster, but I'm enjoying the ride.
Hopefully you'll have a break at some point in the future. Let's start with what consciousness is and how your approach to it, which draws on the philosopher Thomas Nagel, is about getting to the subjective experience rather than the functional aspects of how consciousness works, such as metacognition studies.
Yeah, sure. It's always a good idea to start with definitions, but without getting too caught up in them, because I don't think we're all going to agree about what we mean individually by consciousness. But put very simply, consciousness is any kind of subjective experience whatsoever. It's what goes away when you go under general anesthesia or fall into a dreamless sleep, and it's what returns when you come round again, and when you come round after surgery or wake up from your dreamless sleep. It's not the same thing as having language. It's not the same thing as being intelligent. It's not a particular kind of behavior. It's really just defined by the presence of any subjective experience whatsoever. And that you mentioned the philosopher Thomas Nagel. He's the person I always go back to because he put it in this very simple way that for a conscious organism or conscious system, there is something it is like to be that system. It feels like something to be that system. It feels like something to be me, rather exhausted, as I just said. It feels like something to be you as well. But for this table in front of me, for the laptop that I'm using to talk to you, there is nothing that it feels like to be those systems. There is no consciousness happening. There is no inner universe. The lights inside are off.
So it seems that consciousness studies remained primarily outside of science and more in the field of philosophy until somewhat recently. And we can refer to David Chalmers' Hard Problem of Consciousness when saying that. What's changed that's enabling you to be able to break down the seemingly unfathomable nature of the topic?
Well, it's interesting. It's been inside and outside of science for as long as there's been science. And consciousness, this question of how experience happens and conscious self, who am I, what it means to be a person. This has been a question for the ages. Some of the oldest philosophers that we know of thought about these sorts of things. And from the very beginning of science, there was this sort of challenge. How do we integrate subjectivity, the first-person perspective, into what seems to be an enterprise, a human enterprise that is defined by being objective about things? You can put an object, a cup of tea, a frog, a piece of grass, a molecule on a table. You can look at it and make measurements, but you can't put a conscious experience on the table and all see that conscious experience. I can't put my conscious experience right here and right now on a table or a lab bench or whatever, so that many people can look at it at the same time. It's intrinsically subjective. That's why it's been treated as sometimes rather fringe, or, as you put it, sometimes completely outside the remit of science, something very disreputable. Certainly when I was starting off in the early 1990s, consciousness was not on the menu. But it had been before. At the beginning of psychology and neuroscience in the late 19th century, consciousness was widely recognized as the central question, quite rightly so. But because of these problems in how to get the data, it became more the territory of philosophy and also religion, of course. So what's changed? Well, a few things have changed. For one thing, the balance has just redressed itself a bit. You can't study the mind and the brain forever without eventually returning to what is the central problem. How does consciousness happen? But we also have better methods now. We have brain scanning technology. We can put people inside brain scanners and observe what happens inside their brains when they're having particular kinds of conscious experiences, or when they fall asleep or go under anesthesia. That gives us very direct data about the brain basis of consciousness. And there's many other experimental methods now where we can manipulate what people are consciously aware of while keeping other things constant, like keeping the data that's coming into their eyes or ears the same. So the combination of these sorts of methods and the development of new theories as well that try to explain why conscious experiences relate to the brain in the ways that they do, these things have all given rise to an emerging, not quite mature, but definitely an exciting new science of consciousness since the 1990s.
What drew you in to this as a field of study, and how did you start to think about some of these ways of measuring consciousness?
This is a great question, and I always find it quite difficult to answer because for me, this question was always there. You know, I remember as a kid just having these questions in my head. Who am I? How does experience happen? It's one of the big mysteries of the world that I think many people wonder about at one time or another in their life. But the way education works is often that you just get educated out of thinking about these big questions and taught what are supposedly useful things, lots of facts, how the GDP is calculated, things like that. But this basic question of consciousness was always there in the background. I didn't expect ever to develop a career researching it. It just didn't seem possible because it did seem to be, well, that's what a philosopher does, or that's what a priest does, something like that. But I think I was just quite lucky that starting university in the 90s was the time where the study of consciousness was beginning, at least in a few places, to become legitimized again. And it took me a while. My undergraduate degree was in something else, in physics, and then in psychology, and then I studied computer science. But eventually, all the pieces came back together, and I was able to refocus on this central question about how the brain and the body determine our inner universes.
Reading Being You, it's clear that the approach to it isn't through one discipline. It's a multi-disciplinary approach that you're taking. I'm just fascinated how, because when we think of academics, sometimes we think of them as working in silos of thought, and you clearly are not doing that. So can you just tell us a little bit about how you were approaching this?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way I think about consciousness, and I'm not alone in this, the way many consciousness researchers operate is in a very interdisciplinary manner. Consciousness is not the sort of question that fits neatly into any single silo, whether it's philosophy or neuroscience or physics or maths. It's too big a mystery for that. It draws on all these different fields. And so in my group, part of what I have to do is manage these interactions between different disciplines, between people with different training. I can't know myself absolutely all the details. Like there's a point at which my mathematical ability stops. But I have to know enough to allow a mathematician to talk to a psychologist in a way that keeps a focus on this central question of consciousness. But I think there's a larger point here too, which is that these disciplines that we have in academia, these silos, they are rather arbitrary. And they're the accident of history. They're the way they are because they make teaching administratively more easy. Different disciplines do pick out different areas of focus for sure, but there is absolutely no guarantee that nature itself is carved along the joints as they're reflected in different disciplines.
Mm-hmm.
You provide a really helpful picture of neuroscience and how it's shifted from the metaphor of the brain as a computer to a prediction machine. Can you give our listeners a sense of this top-down predictions from the brain meeting bottom-up sensory perception and how that creates a kind of error correction? And all of that comes together to construct our sense of reality.
Absolutely. When we think about the brain, when neuroscientists or academics have thought about the brain, we always have to reach for a metaphor of some sort. And this is, of course, how people think in general when faced with something they don't quite understand. The brain as a computer metaphor has been very dominant for a very long time, and it's still there to some extent in most of psychology and neuroscience. And it's not entirely wrong. There is an interesting way to think about the brain as taking in some information, signals enter the senses, stuff happens inside, and we do stuff. We move our limbs, we move our mouths to make sounds when we speak. There's this input to output process, which is in a way a little bit like what a computer does too. And there are things like memory that computers have, and we have a form of memory. But taking this metaphor too far is very dangerous. If we think of the brain as literally like a computer, with the body relegated to the meat robot that moves the brain computer from one meeting to another, and that understanding the mind is simply a matter of figuring out what program the wetware of the brain is running, then I think we get radically misled. There are very, very many differences between biological brains and silicon computers. Memory, for instance, just to take one example. Memory in a computer, you store a file, and then when you retrieve it, it's the same file. At least it should be if your computer is working properly. But human memory isn't like that at all. Every time you remember something, you recreate it, you regenerate it, and it becomes, if anything, slightly less accurate the more often you recall it. That's just one way in which functionally the brain and the computer are different.
Which is quite reassuring, I think, in some ways.
It's very reassuring. I don't like to think of my brain as this as this information processing device. It makes it less embodied. It makes it less real in some way. And it also leads, there's one other central idea in this metaphor of the brain as a computer, which is that then consciousness becomes something that you can simulate on a computer and give rise to consciousness by simulating. So for some things, this is true, right? If you program a computer to play chess, it's actually playing chess. Computer that plays chess. But if you simulate a weather system on a computer, say you're into forecasting storms, something like that, you have a very fast computer, you simulate in great detail how a hurricane develops. Now, it will never get wet or windy inside the computer. It's always only going to be a simulation, however accurate, however detailed it is. Consciousness might be more like the weather than like chess. It might not be something that can be simulated in all its detail. You might actually depend on the stuff, the real stuff that's inside our skulls. And that's for me, one of the big questions. I don't have an answer to that question, but I don't want to assume an answer one way or the other by taking a metaphor too far.
Another great lesson you provide is an introduction to Bayesian inference and how our brain is performing this form of abductive reasoning unconsciously. Can we start with some basic definitions of the different types of reasoning and then why Bayes has been such an influence in your work?
Yes, of course. This actually connects to this idea of the brain as a prediction machine. So Bayesian reasoning is this form of rationality introduced by the Reverend Thomas Bayes back in the 18th century. And it's all about making optimal decisions under conditions of uncertainty, which, if you think about it, basically characterizes everything. We're always living in conditions of uncertainty, whether that's uncertainty at the level of our beliefs, what we think might happen tomorrow, or even if we just open our eyes, the sensory data coming in through our eyes and ears is ambiguous and uncertain with respect to what's actually out there in the world. So there are three types of reasoning to cover here. The first, and probably the most familiar, the sort of Sherlock Holmes reasoning, is deductive reasoning. And this is where you have some premises or some facts which you know to be true. And if you know those facts to be true, then something else follows. So if I know that Jack is older than Jill and John is older than Jack, then I know that John is older than Jill, right? It just has to be. That's guaranteed. That's deductive reasoning. If the premises are true, the consequences are guaranteed to be true. Then there's inductive reasoning. And we humans do a lot of this too. And this is basically just extrapolation from previous circumstances. So the classic example is the sun has always risen in the east, and so tomorrow it will also rise in the east. Now, this is almost certainly going to be true. I would, of course, bet everything on that being true, but it's not guaranteed to be true. The sun might blow up overnight, possibly. It's very likely, but not guaranteed. That's induction. Of course, there are other situations where we can be radically misled through inductive reasoning. If we overestimate the probability that something is statistically reliable, if I'm pulling balls out of a bag and the first three are red, and if I therefore assume that all the balls in the bag are red, I might be right, but it really depends. I haven't sampled very many of them, so I could go wrong. That's inductive reasoning. And Bayesian reasoning is called abductive. It's a bit of a strange word. I honestly hadn't come across it until relatively recently when thinking about the background to all of this. And abductive reasoning, the way I like to think of it, is reasoning backwards. And this is something we humans find really quite hard to do. So reasoning forwards applies to both inductive and deductive reasoning, from the premises to the consequences, from the sun rising in the east over many days to the sun rising tomorrow. You're always going from potential causes to their effects. But Bayesian inference, abductive reasoning, is about going backwards from effects to their most likely causes. So here's a good example of Bayesian reasoning would be, I wake up in the morning, I look out of the window and I see that the garden is wet. Now, I want to know what was the cause of that. It could have been that it rained overnight, but it could have been that I left the hose pipe on and the sprinkler system was making the lawn wet. And just the fact that the lawn is wet is not enough to decide between these possibilities. I need extra information. I need the prior probabilities of rain and the prior probability of leaving a sprinkler system on. Only then can I make my best guess about why the lawn is wet. So it's not guaranteed to be correct, abductive reasoning, but it is guaranteed to be the best you can do with the uncertain and incomplete knowledge that you have at a time. But we humans find it very difficult. It's very easy to get misled and make inappropriate conclusions in these sorts of situations. A good example of that would be if the test for a nasty disease, not COVID, but like something that's really rare. If a test for a really rare disease comes up positive, and the test is 99% accurate, that it's going to pick up 99% of cases, then you're going to be terrified. It's like, oh my God, I've definitely got this horrible disease. This test is like almost 100% accurate, and it's come up positive. But if the disease is sufficiently rare, if it only maybe has a prevalence of 1 in 500,000 or something like that, then actually your chances of having the disease are still incredibly low, because the prior probability of that disease is very low. So even an accurate test is not good evidence that you have the disease. And we find it very difficult to mentally reckon with these kinds of probabilities. But the brain is actually much better at it, where in other situations. So the whole business of perception, when we open our eyes and the world seems to flood in through our senses directly into our minds, seems to be effortless, right? It doesn't seem to be anything going on at all. Just it seems like the senses are transparent windows to this external world. But actually what's going on is the brain is doing a lot of this reasoning about uncertainty, a lot of this Bayesian inference. It's taking uncertain sensory information and making its best guess about what caused it. And my argument is that is what we consciously perceive.
And just to close the loop. So we're making these. Our brain is making predictions based on abductive reasoning, based on what's happened in the past, and then our senses are basically error correction. It's either confirming or it's and it's that loop between the two. So we are actually the thing that we find consciously hard to do. We're unconsciously just doing. It's the mechanism by which our brains make sense of the world.
Yeah, I think actually it's wise to just separate the two things. So when I'm talking about what humans find hard is when we consciously, explicitly try to reason through things like how likely is it that I've got this nasty disease or not. But in something as natural as perception, whether it's vision or hearing, whatever it is, the idea is the same basic setup that the brain has to make a best guess about the causes of sensory data, but it's happening automatically. Of course, it's not that you open your eyes and you consciously think, this pattern of light, is this actually more likely to come from a coffee cup or a cat? No, you just see a coffee cup or a cat. But under the hood, under the surface of your conscious experience, this, I think, and many others too, this is what's going on. The brain is sending from the top down, from the inside out, these predictions about what's out there in the world. And indeed, the sensory data is mainly used just to calibrate or update these predictions. And this, for me, has been one of the most startling realizations. And I still think about this most days, just when walking around, because it seems as though sensation and perception is just this process of reading out data that's coming from the world, as if there's like a little me inside my head that's just reading off the world from the signals that flow in. But actually, what we perceive is coming from the inside out or the top down. We're actively generating our perceptual experiences. And the sensory data is just reporting the difference between what the brain expects and what it gets. It's a prediction error. And it's by minimizing prediction error everywhere, by updating these predictions, these top-down predictions to minimize prediction error, that the brain settles on a best guess. And actually, that's how it implements this process of abductive reasoning, of Bayesian inference.
So interesting. Okay, so I'm fascinated as well with your experience of LSD microdosing. What was that like, and why were you doing it?
Well, it was a macro dose. It wasn't a micro dose.
Oh, okay.
If you're interested in consciousness, then there's some imperative, I think, to try to understand the range of possible conscious experiences. And it's a classic method in science too. If you want to understand how a system works, you perturb it in different ways and you see what happens. And for something that is intrinsically subjective, then to some extent, I also need to see what happens from a first-person perspective, what happens to me. So I did want to try it from the first-person perspective. This is not something that I recommend to everyone at all, by no means. But I do think for me, it helped make sense of some of these ideas that we just talked about, this idea of the brain as a prediction machine and perception and our experience as a process of top-down best guessing. Because one of the things that happens during a psychedelic experience is that your perceptions are less tied to their causes in the world than they might otherwise be. You look at some clouds in the sky and they start taking on very different kinds of shapes, different perceptual modalities fuse together, sounds and light become one. The self begins to dissolve also. And all this is because of a very specific change at the low levels of brain pharmacology. You're changing the activity of a particular chemical neurotransmitter in the brain. And then from that, you get these very, very distinctive and profound changes in experience. So this, for me, conveys a couple of important lessons. Firstly, for me, it's incredibly good evidence that consciousness is a biological phenomenon. Now, you go and you change the brain, and consciousness changes, and it does so in a very specific way. And the second thing I think it reveals is that perception is a construction, because the world stays the same, but we perceive it differently. It's as if the balance between top-down predictions and bottom-up prediction errors has been altered in the psychedelic state. And in fact, one of the things we're trying to do now, and we've been doing for a few years in my lab, is use a combination of machine learning and virtual reality to try to simulate what's happening in different kinds of altered experiential states, whether there's the psychedelic state or whether there are other kinds of states where people report hallucinations like psychosis or Parkinson's disease and so on.
Let's turn to your work in the lab. In the book, you describe some fascinating experiments, including your hallucination machine. Can you tell us about what you were trying to discover?
So this hallucination machine is exactly what I was just describing. It's exactly this way in which we're trying to build computational models of this process of prediction and prediction updating in a way that explains why our experiences are the way they are. So what we did with the hallucination machine, it was actually based on an algorithm developed by Google, which they call the deep dream algorithm. And what the deep dream algorithm does is it takes an algorithm that's usually used to figure out which objects are in an image. You show it a bunch of photos and it will tell you, this is a dog, this is a cat, this is a potato, something like that. And machine learning is really very good at this now, very good at classifying images into categories. But you can run it the other way around. You can fix the category and then update the image. And intuitively, this is like projecting a prediction into an image. It's like ramping up the perceptual prediction part of what's going on in the brain and ramping down the ability of sensory signals to update it. And so when you do this, you get this very weird result, which looks like objects like cats and dogs. If you fix dog, for instance, then the image will start to grow dogs out of it in all sorts of weird ways that are very, very different from just photoshopping an image of a dog onto another photo. So we took this and we did it with a panoramic video that people could watch through a virtual reality headset as a way of simulating, in the first instance, what a psychedelic experience might be like. And of course, it's not exactly the same. Of course, it isn't. But it captures some of the features. And for us, this was a starting point of a new method, really, which I've come to call computational phenomenology. And it's a bit of a mouthful, but basically the idea is, can we use computational models of brain mechanisms, not to understand how brains do what they do in terms of function, like generating a particular behavior or processing some information in some useful way, but how they map onto different kinds of experience. Can I explain why a psychedelic experience is the way it is in terms of a computational model of the visual system and so on? And that's, for me, a very exciting line of research. And I think it's one of the ways we'll actually begin to solve this deep challenge of consciousness.
You talk about consciousness as a construct and that psychedelic experience gives evidence to that. Could somebody argue that the psychedelic experience is a disruption to what's going on as opposed to evidence of a sort of changed construct? Does that make sense?
It sort of makes sense, yeah. So that actually, it's interesting that different people will take different lessons from a psychedelic experience. It actually goes back to our previous exchange about Bayesian reasoning and priors. Depends what your prior beliefs are. Now, if you're like me and you have this prior belief that consciousness is a natural phenomenon, that it's something that is intimately tied to the brain and is generated or identical to some biological process, then psychedelics are very, very good evidence for that, because you change the brain and your consciousness changes. That seems entirely natural to me. But if you start from a very different set of prior beliefs, that consciousness is maybe more fundamental, more primary, and that human everyday experience is some sort of filtered down version of what consciousness really is or really could be, then for that starting point, a psychedelic experience can be evidence for precisely the opposite. What I said, that there's this whole world of of consciousness that expands beyond normal daily life, and psychedelics is opening the valve, opening the
Aldous
filter.
Huxley kind of approach.
Exactly. It's a very Huxley approach. And what's fascinating to me is that you still get this division. There was actually a survey done by one of my colleagues, which asked people pretty much this question. So, does a psychedelic experience make you become more materialist? That is, more we have greater conviction that consciousness is a biological phenomenon, or less? And before this survey was carried out, I was quite confident that there would be more people saying that it would make them more materialist, that would be pretty universal. But I was wrong. I was definitely in the minority. For a lot of people, the psychedelic experience is taken as evidence that consciousness still has this immaterial spiritual dimension.
So ever since we had Mark Solms on last season, I've been trying to get my head around the notion of the free energy principle. Can you try to help me understand what it is and why it's important?
I can try. And you're not alone. It's such a tricky area, and it's still evolving. It's still encountering a lot of controversy. But let me try and put it very, very simply. It's something that certainly I've been struggling to understand for more than 10 years myself. It's another way to think of what perception is for and what it's about. So we've already got this idea on the table that when we perceive the outside world, what's happening is the brain is throwing predictions out there and updating these predictions on the basis of sensory data. Why is it doing this? Well, the obvious answer, the first glance answer, is that the brain is trying to figure out what's there. That's what perception is for. Okay, that assumption is wrong, right? The brain is not always trying to figure out what's there, if ever. Perception is not calibrated according to its accuracy. It's calibrated according to its utility. We don't perceive things as they are. We perceive them as it's useful for the organism to do so. Like a color in the world, even though we experience it as being a property of the world, doesn't really exist as an independent property of the world. You know, the brain invents colors so that we behave in ways that help us stay alive. Okay, so that's one thing. We also perceive the interior of our own body. So the self, and this experience of being a person, and this is where in the book this is where we end up really, is the self is not the thing that does the perceiving. The self is a kind of perception. Now that's also, in my view, generated by this exchange of prediction and prediction error. But now the purpose of perception here really isn't to figure out what's there. Like, my brain doesn't care where my internal organs are or what shape or color they are. It just cares whether they are working properly. So prediction here is all about control. It's not about figuring stuff out. And control is like the end point of utility. Something is useful, and then you go from utility to control. And if you can predict something, you can control it much better. So the purpose of perceiving the body is to control the body. Now we have that on the table too. And now we can get to the free energy principle, which is basically the same idea from the other direction. The free energy principle says something like this. It says, for something to exist, to keep existing, let's stick to living things for the moment. For living things to keep existing, they have to remain in a certain set of states consistent with their continuing to exist. Like, there's not many internal body temperatures which are consistent with me remaining alive. You know, internal body temperature, we know, has to be very, very tightly regulated. So the body has to stay within this limited subset of states out of a massive repertoire of possible states. There are many more arrangements of the molecules in my body that could occur. Most of them would be consistent with me being dead rather than alive. So how do living systems remain in this little subset of states consistent with their persistence over time? They have to minimize the surprisingness of the states they encounter. They want to remain in expected states. Like, an expected state for my body is its temperature of whatever, 37 degrees centigrade. And the free energy principle says that what allows systems to do this is by this minimization of a quantity called free energy. And this is the bit I'm going to skip over because that term, it comes from statistical mechanics and thermodynamics, and we don't really need it. The thing we actually need is to know that free energy on the one hand is an approximation to this overall surprisingness of states that the organism could be in. So if you minimize free energy, you're minimizing the surprisingness of the states and therefore maximizing your ability to stay alive. And on the other side, free energy turns out to be very close to, or sometimes the same as, prediction error. And so it's exactly this signal that in this other way of telling the story, that the brain is always minimizing prediction error, you can think of that as minimizing free energy and maximizing the chances of staying alive. That's one way of thinking about the free energy principle. There's an awful lot of devil in the detail, and there's a paper by a colleague of mine, Manuel Baltieri, has just come out the other day, which is sort of criticizing some of the fundamental assumptions about it. And so the discussion is going back and forth, but I think there's something very, very appealing about the basic idea.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Can we move to your work and its intersect with artificial intelligence? The emergence of AI is, for some, a real leap forward. We had Kevin Kelly, the Wired co-founder, speak to us about his optimism that's going to be a really positive ally to human development. And others, such as the former Google CEO, Eric Schmidt, who suggests that AI could be a real problem to us, things like AI-enhanced cyber weapons. How are you seeing your work influencing our thinking on the development of AI?
There's a rich interaction here, and it plays out at several different levels. At one level, I think it plays out in a very pragmatic and useful way. And actually, it does connect directly to these ideas of the prediction machine and of the free energy principle. Because we can think of this whole process of minimizing prediction error and generating predictions as a kind of machine learning, as a kind of artificial intelligence. It's a way of creating systems that perceive well, that control things well, that act in the world well. So one of the things that we're doing at Sussex with my colleagues is using some of these ideas to try to develop better machine learning algorithms, things that have that are good in ways that current machine learning is not very good at. That, for instance, can learn adaptively from small amounts of data. We humans are very good at that. We don't need to be exposed to the entire internet in order to learn to classify ostriches. We see a couple of ostriches and bang, we do it. We can also learn new things without forgetting old things. Machine learning is typically really bad at this. You train it to do one thing, and then you kind of have to start all over again to do the next thing. So there's lots of things that we can do that current AI is not very good at, that ideas of the brain as a prediction machine can actually help with. I think that's the first thing. And actually, it goes both ways, because we also need advanced computational models and machine learning models to better understand how brains do what they do. So I think in the best case, there's this virtuous circle where we can use neuroscience to develop more interesting, more powerful AI. And on the other side, we can use AI that's developed in light of neurobiology to serve as better models of that biology. But there's another level which I think is more both interesting, but also more concerning in some ways. And this is where we start talking about consciousness in particular. And within AI, within certain branches of AI, there's this idea that wouldn't it be cool to build a conscious machine? Wouldn't it be cool to build a system, whether it's a robot or a next generation iPhone, that actually has experiences? Well, the first thing is we really don't know if that's possible or how to do it. The second thing is I don't think we should even be trying. It's not cool. It's an incredible ethical risk. If you build something that could potentially suffer, and especially if you're not in a position to recognize that it might be suffering, or that suffering for it would be mean something completely different, you've generated an enormous amount of of artificial suffering, which is a huge catastrophe. Wouldn't want to do that. I'm not saying that we're on the fringe of it. I don't think we're on the fringe or the verge of it at all. But I just do think it's not something to try just because it's cool. We should be very careful about building new kinds of technology that we don't fully understand or understand the consequences thereof. However, we can build systems that have some of the functions of consciousness. And this is not only with respect to learning that I was just talking about, the ability to learn new things or from small amounts of data. But for instance, a lot of AI these days is rather opaque. That is, it can do what it does, but it's very hard to know how or why it's doing what it does. There's a need, and this is widely recognized, a need for more explainable, more transparent AI. And so building systems that have the ability to introspect on how they do things, or for instance, assign confidence judgments to how well they think they're doing things, could be very useful. And that's the sort of thing we do when we're conscious. When we're conscious of something, we're able to express a degree of confidence or uncertainty in it. And we can also, not always with complete accuracy, but we can also reflect on how we've come to a decision. So I think there are ways that we can, this is what we typically call metacognition, the ability to reflect on ongoing cognitive processes. And I think by building these functions into AI, we may not only enhance performance, but enhance explainability, enhance reliability, trustworthiness, all these sorts of things that I think are necessary for the ethical development of AI.
So the thing that prompts immediately here is because you're making the distinction between having AI that develops its own kind of consciousness and could be locked in this hell of suffering. How do you get AI to have metacognition but not cross that line into the kind of world that you're talking about?
It's a really good question, and I think anybody who claims to know the answer is probably kidding themselves. The problem is we don't know what the minimal sufficient conditions are for consciousness. Now, I can already write a computer program that would have some basic level of metacognition. It's not difficult, right? You just point one neural network at another neural network and you've got it. And that's metacognition, but nobody would claim that there's suddenly something it is like to be that computer program just because it implements that kind of function. The question is, will there be a point at which there is something it is like to be that system as you just incrementally increase its complexity? At some point, you start putting grains of sand on a table. At some point, it becomes a pile of sand and not just a bunch of grains of sand. Is there some threshold where there becomes this qualitative difference? I don't know the answer to that. It could be, no, there isn't ever any point. You can just implement these functions like metacognition in a computer, but back to an earlier part of our conversation, that would always be a simulation. It's just a useful simulation in this sense. But it could be that at some point, no, this thing is actually having experiences. I personally think that's quite unlikely because the work that I've been doing and the trajectory that my thinking has taken over the years is that to be actually conscious is intimately tied not only to the functional things that our brains do, but to our nature as living machines, which also connects to the free energy principle. Because we are living machines, we have all this predictive regulation. And in a living system, there's no sharp division between the mindware and the wetware. Like we might think of neurons and then activity flowing between neurons, but why is it that? In any case, anytime two neurons fire, the structure of the brain changes. And living systems bootstrap themselves into existence like all the way down. Even a single cell is preserving its own integrity over time. So personally, I remain agnostic about whether a computer could ever be conscious unless it's a living machine. But I tend to think that the livingness matters.
Good.
If you're enjoying The Evolving Leader, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. And don't forget to follow along on Instagram and LinkedIn. You can find us at at Evolving Leader. Thank you for listening. Now, let's get back to the show.
Let's come back to humans for a moment, because this show is about helping leaders to think about the future. Given everything that you have discovered and you're continuing to work on, what does all of this tell us about being human, that you think the people who take leadership roles in the world, in any level, need to know about themselves?
I think there's a number of things, directions we could go here. One thing I think that is useful is this recognition of perception as this construction. We generate our experienced world and our experienced selves. And this has a number of implications. Firstly, it means that the way you see things, and this is as simple as the world in front of you when you open your eyes, or it could be the way you see your organization and how it works, doesn't mean that that's the way it is. You always experience an interpretation of it, even if you don't think it is, even if you think it's objective and accurate. It isn't. It's always an interpretation. And I think having that element of modesty and humility about your perception enables you to change your perception. And change, of course, is very important. We have to be able to change our minds, and we have to recognize that the way it seems to us might not be either the way it is or the way it seems to other people too. So another implication of perception as construction is that even in the same situation, we will all have slightly different, or perhaps even very different, experiences of that situation. And again, that could be as simple as the perceptual world in front of us, or the way we experience how a whole system is working. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is that perception applies to the self too. So the experience of being the individual that you are is a collection of perceptions. It is not the thing that does the perceiving. This also means that you yourself are a constant invention of your brain, an ongoing invention of your brain. The emotions that you feel are also perceptions. And we know, not just in leadership positions, but in everyday life, it's very easy to get led by your emotions. And we also know that emotions are very, very important in decision making. It's not that we want to be these cold, Spock-like engines of rationality. No, emotions are essential in guiding adaptive decision making in every single context in which we live. But we shouldn't over-endow emotions with a sort of magical power, because emotions are also perceptions. They do not necessarily reflect things as they are. We're basically perceiving a best guess about our body's response to a particular situation. And again, it's not accuracy that matters here, it's utility. Is this a useful response to have in this situation? So recognizing emotion as a kind of perception allows the same sort of insight. We can again induce a little gap between how things seem and how they are. We can recognize our emotion for what it is, a construction that is often useful, but maybe not always, and that other people's emotions play the same role. So those are two things I think that can be useful yardsticks for navigating complex situations.
Yeah, those are really brilliant applications.
I'd be really interested to get a sense of, what's the next frontiers for your research?
Sure. So I've been working in this area for years now, and it's always a challenge to keep a lab going and so on, and to keep coming up with new frontiers, new ideas, new things to explore. But fortunately, in the area of consciousness, and especially in its applications within AI and within understanding human behavior generally, there's plenty of opportunity. There are two things that I'm particularly fascinated in right now. One is this idea of emergence. Now, emergence is a concept that has a lot of baggage, a lot of controversy as well. Intuitively, it means when something is more than the sum of its parts. Like you see a flock of birds wheeling around the sky, and the flock seems to have a life of its own that is more than the sum of the birds that make up the flock. But we know there really isn't anything more to the flock than a bunch of birds flying around. So how do we understand this notion of the flock being an emergent property of the birds? If the birds fly around randomly, there is no flock. But if they fly in a flocky kind of way, then there is. So one of the things I'm trying to do is put some flesh on those bones. How do we come up with a mathematical theory of flockiness, of emergence? Because if we can do that, and there are several ways that we can do that, that can be applied much more generally. It can be applied to the brain too. You have a whole bunch of neurons firing, yet a conscious experience seems to be more than the sum of the activities of all the different neurons. So can we understand the emergent nature of consciousness, the fact that it seems to have a trajectory, a life of its own, hangs together as a whole? Can we understand that as an emergent property of the parts, in the same way that a flock of birds is emergent from the birds that make it up? This for me is a really exciting convergence of, again, sort of philosophy and mathematics and physics and psychology, tackling something that's been so controversial for very many years. And I'm really lucky to have a lot of super talented mathematical colleagues who I'm working with on different approaches to this problem. And the second thing I'm really interested in at the moment is in individual differences in perception. We touched on this a little bit already, that because our brains are all going to be different, whether in small ways or big ways, we're all going to inhabit slightly different perceptual universes, even if we're in exactly the same objective situation. But a lot of this diversity is kind of hidden. We don't tend to recognize differences in how we perceive things unless they're quite extreme, sort of in the things that are usually described under the banner of neurodiversity, when people might have autism or synesthesia or hypersensitivity or something like that. But I think there's a lot of variation in how we perceive things that is just not apparent in daily life. Like, we're all different heights, but that is very, very easy to observe, because even a small difference in height is observable. When you see somebody, though, slight tangent, one of the weirdnesses of Zoom, and I don't know if you found this, but basically, having spent nearly 2 years only talking to people on Zoom, everyone is the same height on Zoom. Yeah. And when you meet in real life, you suddenly think, oh my God, you're really tall, or you're really short. And it's just the number of times this has happened to me. It's quite amazing, actually. So this, and we can even think of that as my brain has developed this prior belief that everyone is the same height. And that's a Zoom-induced perceptual prior, which is turning out to be not very reliable. But end of that sidebar, I'm very interested in exposing this kind of hidden variance in how we each perceive the world, because I think that's a very underexplored area of consciousness research and psychology, and I think it's one that might have a lot of implications for understanding societal interactions.
It's interesting because about 10 years ago there seemed to be a peak in emergent science, which seemed to then sort of wane a bit. Santa Fe Institute and others were doing a lot of work on emergence, but I think it was coming more from a kind of statistical analysis and rather than from your perspective. How do you think when, like in a decade, when exponential computing power and, imaging keeps on, evolving, what do you think you might be able to do then that you can't now?
The one technological advance that I really hope we get, but I'm not massively optimistic about, would be a step change in brain imaging ability. We've been using pretty much the same brain imaging technologies for quite a long time now. We have functional magnetic resonance imaging, functional MRI, which is really good at locating changes in brain activity in space, but has a very poor time resolution because it's not actually measuring neural activity. It's measuring changes in blood oxygenation, which go along with neural activity, but have a very slow time course. And then we have methods like electroencephalography, EEG, or magnetoencephalography, MEG, which have very good time resolution, but their ability to localize things in space is much less good. And then maybe for really some cases, we actually are able to record directly from inside the brain, where we know exactly where we are and we have very good time resolution, but we'd had very poor coverage. We may only have a few different spots we're recording from. So there's no current technology that gives us both coverage, spatial resolution, and temporal resolution. And so if you think of the old allegory of people, blind men trying to figure out whether it's an elephant, and they're all putting their hands on different parts of it and so on. We don't have enough blind people on this elephant yet. We need more ways of actually charting what's going on in the brain at the granularity where we can see it operating as a whole in detail. That technology isn't really there. It might be there for some simple non-laboratory preparations. There's, of course, the exciting technology of optogenetics, which can do this, but not in humans. So again, limitation. That would be a game changer. I mean, there's a lot of progress that can be made with the technologies that we have, but that kind of super brain imaging technology would be a real game changer. What is getting better all the time is, of course, computational resources, computational power. But frankly, I'm not sure how much difference that makes. I mean, we have enough of computational juice to run very large models, but what we really need is better theories at this point. We're swimming in a sea of data. I'm maybe going against the previous point here. We're swimming in a sea of data, but the data are limited data. They're not the broad coverage data that I hope we can get. And when you're swimming in oceans of data that is systematically missing bits and pieces, then you need really strong theories to connect them all up and make them predictive and explanatory with respect to the things you're trying to explain. And in consciousness science at the moment, we're at this stage where there are a bunch of theories, and these ideas of the prediction machine, that's one sort of theoretical tradition. It's not just me, of course. I'm working alongside and on the shoulders of many, many others. But there are other theories out there as well that say things about consciousness. And these theories at the moment talk past each other. It's not like some grand scientific competition where one is going to win and there's going to be a definitive experiment. And so there needs to be development of these theories in ways that make them more comparable. And this is beginning to happen. There's an initiative from the Templeton World Charity Foundation, which is trying to fund research programs that pit one theory or class of theory against another. I think that kind of initiative is going to be very, very interesting in the years that follow.
Now, when we were talking to Mark Solms, he was saying that when he started off in the consciousness and took a kind of detour into psychiatry to understand it from a subjective point, and he was ostracized by his scientific peers, thinking that he'd lost his marbles. It sounds from your perspective that there's a much more openness to the divisions between these different disciplines, but do we need more multidisciplinary approaches to this? And I'm thinking even outside of science, to get the kind of theories and the creativity around them, or is that happening?
I think it does need to happen more. It's a lot of people pay lip service to interdisciplinarity, but to actually embed it and make it a culture is a real challenge. I do think I've been quite lucky in having relatively flexible research funding that has allowed me to hire across these different disciplines and keep people together over the years that it will take sometimes for exchanges across disciplinary boundaries to become somewhat the norm. And even now, it is a constant challenge to keep things going in an interdisciplinary way. There's just this like centrifugal force that seems to pull people into their silos to do the things they feel most comfortable with. And this definitely includes the humanities. It includes philosophy, but I think it goes even more broadly than philosophy. We think about consciousness, literature is probably our best source of understanding what the phenomenology of being a human individual is like. What is the experience of being a self? Well, literature, film will tell us that. Film is amazingly interesting because film is a series of experiments into how perception works. a film director and a film editor has to have a fantastically finesse knowledge of how people pay attention, when they blink, when they move their eyes, how they construct visual scenes on the basis of data that's sparse and intermittent. So there's huge opportunity for integration across fields that you might think on the face of it have nothing to say to each other.
Who is, most inspiring you as a thinker? Who are the people that you kind of are turning to, either from the past? I mean, we talked about Thomas Nagel, but the past or the present. Who are the people that are making you challenge your own assumptions?
There are many people that force me to think and inspire me to think and do things. There are people that I've learned from. These would be people like the philosopher Thomas Metzinger in Germany, the neuroscientist Nancy Kanwisher in the US. It's hard to pick particular names. There's a lot. There's just so many people that I've learned from. Daniel Dennett, one of my most valued kind of mentors and inspirations over the years. Another philosopher who's really incisive about consciousness. Not that I agree with all of these people. It's interesting. You can, of course, be inspired and learn without necessarily always coming to a point of convergence. But I have to say that the people that I learn from the most and that inspire me the most are the people I work with day to day, my colleagues, my postdocs and PhD students, who are really at the coalface of all this, doing the work and forcing us all to get down into the details and think harder about what we're doing and why we're doing it. And that's the real pleasure of being involved in any kind of activity like this. But science is intrinsically, at least in my experience, a collaborative community enterprise, and working with colleagues who have different skills, who have different perspectives, different interests. That's one of the joys and one of the rewards.
Well, we're going to bring it to a close here. I'm going to say a huge thank you to you. I know how exhausted you must be after many months of public engagement around your book and this topic. And I have to say, the consistent thing in all the times I've seen you, either offline or online, is just a huge amount of energy you bring to this, and the generosity of spirit in sharing these ideas time and time again. But every time it's slightly, kind of imbued with a new kind of emphasis and angle. And you've done that for this show. So, Professor Seth, thank you so much for joining us on The Evolving Leader.
Yeah, Anil, thank you so much. This is a pleasure. I'm conscious that I'm going to be thinking about this conversation for quite a while, so really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. It's very kind of you to say so, and it's been a real pleasure. Thanks very much.
All right, folks, be sure to pick up the book, Being You, today. And until next time, remember, the world is evolving. Are you?